I never told my husband's family that I used to be a military lawyer, not once. Not in 12 years of holiday dinners, not at a single birthday party, not even the night Ethan's father raised his glass and called me the girl who plays soldier on weekends. I let it go. I let all of it go. And on the day my divorce hearing began, I walked into that courtroom completely alone. No attorney beside me, no briefcase full of paralegals, just me, a folder, and a silence I had built for 15 years. Richard laughed the second he saw me sit down without counsel. Couldn't afford a real lawyer, sweetheart. His whole family laughed with him. I pulled out my chair, sat down, and said nothing at all. My name is Autumn Spencer. I'm 38 years old, a major in the United States Army Reserve, and I've spent 15 years of my life in a uniform. Most people in that courtroom never bothered to understand. To them, I was always just the Army wife who disappears for a few weeks a year. Nobody in the Spencer family ever asked what I actually did out there, not once in over a decade. And I never offered it up because offering it up never seemed to matter to any of them. I met Ethan when I was 26, home on leave, still raw from my first deployment overseas. He was charming in that easy, polished way, the kind of man who fills a room just by walking into it, who orders wine without looking at the menu, who assumes the world was built to accommodate his schedule. I fell for that confidence before I understood what it actually was. Underneath the charm was a man who needed to be the smartest person at every table, and somewhere along the way I stopped correcting him when he acted like he was. His family made their opinion of me clear early. Richard Spencer. His father spent 30 years as a corporate attorney before retiring into a life of golf memberships and dinner parties. And he had a particular way of looking at people in uniform, like we were hired help who happened to wear green instead of black. Linda, Ethan's mother, was softer about it, but no less dismissive. To her, I was always that girl from the base. Even after I'd been married into their family for over a decade, even after I gave them a granddaughter. I stayed quiet about my career for one simple reason Ethan asked me to. Early in our marriage, after I mentioned a case I'd worked during a family dinner, he pulled me aside in the kitchen, his voice low and tight. Don't bring the Army stuff to the table, Autumn. It makes people uncomfortable. I remember standing there with a dish towel in my hand, feeling something small and important fold itself up inside me and disappear. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I told myself 100 times over the years that it wasn't worth the fight. Looking back now, I think that was the moment the marriage started dying long before either of us admitted it out loud. 12 years. A daughter named Grace who has my eyes and Ethan's stubborn chin. A house in a neighborhood Richard picked out for us because he said it would look right for the family. And then, 8 months ago, I found out about the affair. A co-worker from his firm texts, going back over a year, hotel charges I'd been too tired, too busy, too trusting to notice. Ethan didn't deny it. He didn't even really apologize. He just said the marriage had run its course, and that he wanted out the house, the savings, the investment accounts, and primary custody of Grace. He said it flatly, like he was closing a business deal, like 12 years of my life were a line item he was ready to write off. He hired the most expensive divorce firm in the city, Blackwell & Hunt, a name that made grown men in this town lower their voices with respect. Richard bragged about it to anyone who'd listen. $950 an hour, he said, like it was a number that should frighten me into submission. And I told everyone I wasn't hiring a lawyer. My own mother asked if I was in shock. My sister begged me to at least get a consultation. Even Ethan looked at me strangely when his attorney's office confirmed I'd be representing myself, like he was waiting for the punchline, waiting for me to admit I was bluffing. I wasn't bluffing. I was waiting. The morning of the hearing, I put on my Army service uniform, not for effect, though it certainly looked that way later. I'd come straight from a memorial service for a soldier I served with years ago, a formality I couldn't reschedule even for this. Richard took one look at me walking into that courthouse and smirked at his wife. She thinks this is a parade, I heard him. I let it pass over me the way water passes over stone. I had spent 15 years learning exactly how to sit still while people underestimated me, and I intended to use every single day of that training. Because what none of them knew, what I had never once told them, not in 12 Thanksgivings, not in 12 Christmases, not in a single argument at that too formal dinner table, was that before I became just a soldier to this family, I spent 9 years as a judge advocate. I had stood in front of military courts more times than I could count. I had cross-examined officers twice my rank. I had built cases out of nothing and taken apart cases that seemed unbreakable. Richard smiled at me from across that courtroom like a man who already knew how the story would end. He had no idea he was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life. The days before the hearing felt strange, almost suspended, like I was standing outside my own life, watching it happen to someone else. I went through the motions, packing Grace's lunch running drills at the armory, sitting across from Ethan's attorney during a deposition where he barely looked at me, except to ask with poorly disguised amusement whether I understood the seriousness of representing myself. I understood it better than he could imagine. I joined the Army at 22, 3 months after finishing my undergraduate degree, mostly because I needed direction, and the recruiter's office was 2 doors down from a coffee shop where I sat every morning trying to figure out what to do with my life. I didn't come from money. I didn't come from connections. What I had was a mind that worked well under pressure and a stubbornness my mother used to call exhausting when I was a teenager. The Army noticed the stubbornness before I did. During basic officer training, an instructor pulled me aside and asked if I'd ever considered law school. I hadn't, not seriously, but something about the question lodged itself in my chest and wouldn't let go. 2 years later, the Army sent me through its funded legal education program, and I came out the other side commissioned into the Judge Advocate General's Corps JAG, the branch most civilians only know from movies usually pronounced with a raised eyebrow and a joke about courtroom dramas. It was nothing like the movies. It was long nights with case files spread across a folding table in some forward operating base trying to build an argument by generator light because the power had gone out again. It was defending a young specialist accused of a crime he didn't commit, watching the relief break across his face when the panel returned a not guilty verdict. It was prosecuting a contracting officer who'd been skimming funds meant for local infrastructure projects, watching him realize halfway through cross-examination that I'd already found the account he thought was hidden. I spent 9 years like that. Courts-martial, contract fraud investigations, administrative separation boards. I learned how to read a witness the way some people read weather patterns, the small shifts that tells the places where confidence cracked into something more honest. I learned that most people who lie under oath don't lie with dramatic flair. They lie in small, careful pieces, and the job of a good attorney is patience, waiting for those pieces to stop fitting together. I met Ethan during a 2-week leave back when I still talked about my work with the kind of unguarded enthusiasm you only have before life teaches you to be careful. On our 3rd date, I told him about a case I'd just finished, a complicated one involving falsified maintenance records that had nearly gotten someone killed. He listened, or seemed to nodding in the right places. I remember thinking he was impressed. I understand now that he wasn't impressed. He was cataloging, filing away the parts of me he found interesting and the parts he found inconvenient, deciding early which version of me he wanted to keep. After we married, I transitioned to an administrative command role, a decision I made for practical reasons. Deployments were easier to plan around a family, and Grace was on the way within the first 2 years. I never stopped being a JAG in any way that mattered internally. I kept my bar license active. I stayed current on case law out of habit more than necessity, the way some people keep running even after the race is over because the body remembers what the mind built. But to the outside world, especially to the Spencer family, I became simply military. A category, a uniform, something to be tolerated at dinner and joked about at parties. Richard, in particular, seemed to enjoy needling me about it. At one Christmas gathering, after a few glasses of wine, he asked me in front of the whole table whether the Army had made me forget how to dress for civilian life. Linda laughed softly into her napkin. Ethan said nothing, which somehow hurt more than if he'd laughed along with them. I remember excusing myself to the kitchen, running the water longer than necessary, just to have somewhere to stand that wasn't that table. I never corrected them. Not once. I told myself it was because it didn't matter what they thought, that my worth wasn't tied to their approval. Some of that was true. But if I'm honest with myself now, some of it was simpler than that. I had gotten tired. tired of proving myself in rooms that had already decided who I was before I opened my mouth. So when Ethan's attorney, a sharp young associate named Preston Cole, looked across the table during that final deposition and said almost gently, as if he were doing me a kindness, "Mrs. Spencer without counsel, this process is likely to move very quickly. Maybe 2 hours at most. Are you certain you want to proceed this way?" I simply nodded and said, I understood. I did understand. Better than he knew. That night, after Grace fell asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with the case file spread out in front of me, and for the first time in years, I felt something settle in my chest that felt almost like coming home. I went through their filings line by line. I found the gaps: a suspiciously vague accounting of a business account, a timeline of asset transfers that didn't quite add up, small inconsistencies scattered through pages that Preston Cole's team had clearly assumed no one would scrutinize. I closed the folder around midnight, looked out at the dark yard, where Grace's swing set sat still and quiet, and allowed myself for the first time in a long while a small and private smile. They thought I was walking into that courtroom unarmed. They had no idea what 15 years had actually built inside me. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and damp, the kind of Tuesday that makes a courthouse look older than it is, water stains creeping up the granite steps like veins. I got Grace to school early, kissed the top of her head longer than usual, and told her I'd pick her up myself that afternoon. She had no idea what the day held. I intended to keep it that way for as long as I possibly could. The courtroom was already half full by the time I arrived. Richard had apparently decided this was an event worth mobilizing for. He'd brought Linda, his brother Walter, and even a cousin I hadn't seen since our wedding, all of them dressed like they were attending a minor social function rather than the dissolution of a marriage. I understood walking in that I wasn't just facing Ethan's legal team that day. I was facing an audience that had already reached its verdict. Richard spotted me first. He nudged Linda, and I watched his mouth curl into that particular smile he reserved for moments he considered his own private theater. $950 an hour, he said to Walter, not quietly enough. Best firm in the state. I set my folder down at the empty table where opposing counsel usually sat if there had been one, and I took my seat. My uniform felt different that morning, heavier somehow, though I knew that was just my nerves translating themselves into physical sensation. I had come straight from a memorial service for Staff Sergeant Miguel Reyes, a soldier I'd worked alongside years earlier, killed in a training accident the week before. I hadn't had time to change, and some small, stubborn part of me decided I didn't need to. Richard's laugh carried across the room. Didn't realize we were having a parade today. A few chuckles rippled through the gallery. I didn't turn around. I had spent too many years learning that reacting to noise only gives it more room to grow. Judge Marion Whitfield entered a few minutes later, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and the unhurried authority of someone who had seen every kind of performance a courtroom could offer and had stopped being impressed by most of them decades ago. She looked out over the room, then down at her docket. "Mrs. Spencer," she said, addressing me directly. "Do you have counsel present?" "No, Your Honor." I said, standing. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "I'll be representing myself." I heard Richard's soft exhale of amusement behind me, saw a couple of heads turn in the gallery. Judge Whitfield studied me for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, something unreadable passing behind her expression before she nodded once and turned to opposing counsel. "Mr. Cole, you may proceed with your opening." Preston Cole rose with the kind of practiced confidence that comes from winning cases before they've truly begun. He was younger than I expected for someone leading a case this size, maybe 32, with the sharp haircut and tailored suit of a man who had never once doubted he belonged exactly where he was standing. He spoke for nearly 25 minutes. He painted a picture of Ethan as the stable, present, financially responsible parent, a man who had sacrificed opportunities to be available for his daughter, while I was characterized as frequently absent, unpredictable in schedule, and his words, professionally itinerant, a phrase he clearly enjoyed saying out loud. He cited my deployments as evidence of instability. He suggested delicately but unmistakably that a 10-year-old girl needed consistency, that a reservist mother subject to activation at any time simply could not reliably provide. He noted Ethan's higher income, his ownership stake in his firm, his ability to provide a more traditional and secure home environment. I sat and listened to all of it without moving, my hands folded on the table in front of me, my expression carefully neutral. Inside, something colder and more precise was happening. I was cataloging every claim, every assumption, every place where his argument rested on air rather than evidence. I had done this 100 times before in courtrooms far more hostile than this one, against attorneys far sharper than Preston Cole. Behind me I could feel the Spencer family's satisfaction radiating like heat off summer pavement. Linda nodded along with certain points. Richard leaned toward Walter at one point and murmured something that made his brother smirk. When Cole finally sat down, Judge Whitfield turned her attention to me. "Mrs. Spencer, your response." I stood slowly smoothing the front of my jacket, feeling the weight of every eye in that gallery settle on me at once. For 12 years, I had made myself smaller in rooms like this, not courtrooms exactly, but rooms where the Spencer family gathered and judged and dismissed. Dinner tables, holiday parties, anniversary celebrations where I stood quietly at the edge of conversations that never once asked what I thought. I felt Grace's face in my mind the way she'd looked at me that morning over her cereal bowl, trusting and unaware. I felt Sergeant Reyes's memorial service still sitting heavy in my chest, a reminder of exactly how much time people waste pretending things don't matter when they do. I looked directly at Judge Whitfield, then let my gaze pass briefly over Preston Cole, over Ethan sitting rigid and smug beside him, over Richard's expectant smile in the gallery. "Good morning, Your Honor," I said, and my voice didn't shake at all. "Good morning, Your Honor, Major Autumn Spencer, former Judge Advocate, United States Army." The words landed in that courtroom like a stone dropped into still water, and I watched the silence spread outward in rings. Somewhere behind me I heard Richard's sharp intake of breath cut off mid-sound, as if his own laughter had turned to ash in his throat. Linda's hand, I would learn later, had gone to her chest. Preston Cole's pen stopped moving across his legal pad, entirely hovering there, like he'd forgotten what it was for. Judge Whitfield's expression didn't change much, but something in her eyes sharpened the way a person's attention sharpens when a case that seemed settled suddenly reveals itself to be something else entirely. "Continue, Major Spencer," she said. I did. I addressed Mr. Cole's characterization of my deployment history first because it was the weakest thread in his argument and the easiest to unravel. I cited the specific provisions of the Service Members Civil Relief Act that protect reservists from custody determinations penalizing them for military obligations. I referenced case law actual precedent, not vague assertions establishing that a parent's military status cannot on its own be treated as evidence of parental instability. I watched Cole's confident posture begin almost imperceptibly to stiffen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. 15 years of courtroom experience had taught me that volume is what people reach for when they don't trust their argument to stand on its own. I let the law do the work. Furthermore, I continued opposing counsel's characterization of my professional history omits significant context. I did not simply serve in an administrative capacity. For 9 years I practiced as a judge advocate handling courts-martial contract fraud litigation and administrative separation proceedings. My transition to a command role was a personal choice, made for the benefit of my family, not evidence of any professional limitation. I saw Cole glance sideways at Ethan, a quick questioning look, the kind that says, "Did you know about this?" Ethan's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to meet mine. He hadn't known. Or rather, he had known once in fragments, and had simply chosen never to think about it again after he told me to keep it out of family conversations. The hearing continued, and I began doing something I had done countless times in military courtrooms, but never once in this particular arena I objected. Cleanly, precisely. Each time Cole attempted to introduce testimony without proper foundation, I was on my feet. Objection, Your Honor. Lack of foundation. Counsel is asking the witness to speculate about my professional schedule without any documentation to support the claim. Sustained. A few minutes later, objection, hearsay. The witness is testifying to a conversation she was not party to. Sustained. Each ruling in my favor landed like a small hammer blow against the confidence Preston Cole had walked in with. By the fourth sustained objection, I noticed his hand had started tapping against his legal pad, a small unconscious rhythm of frustration. He glanced at his associate at the far table, a young woman who suddenly seemed very interested in reorganizing her files rather than meeting his eyes. I felt something shift in my chest as the hearing progressed, not triumph exactly, not yet, but a kind of settling, like a key finally turning in a lock that had been stuck for years. This was the version of myself I had folded away at that kitchen table over a decade ago, the version Ethan had asked me to keep quiet, the version his family had never once bothered to ask about. She hadn't disappeared. She had simply been waiting. Behind me I could feel the change in the gallery's atmosphere the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. The whispered comments had stopped. Richard's earlier smugness had drained into something rigid and pale. When I glanced back briefly during a recess in argument, I saw him leaning forward, elbows on his knees, staring at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on his face before, something close to uncertainty. Ethan's testimony came next, and this was where I felt the true weight of the day settle onto my shoulders. 15 years of legal training had taught me how to prepare for cross-examination, how to anticipate the places a witness's story would fracture under careful, patient pressure. But nothing in those 15 years had prepared me for how strange it would feel to apply those skills to the man I had shared a bed with for over a decade, the father of my daughter, someone I had once believed I understood completely. Judge Whitfield called for a brief recess before cross-examination began, giving both sides 15 minutes to regroup. I stayed seated at my table, breathing slowly, deliberately, the way I'd trained myself to do before difficult depositions overseas. I thought about Grace, about the swing set in our backyard, about every quiet dinner where I'd swallowed some small insult from this family because I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I thought about the folder in front of me filled with bank statements and email records I had spent months quietly gathering, not out of paranoia, but out of the same methodical instinct that had made me good at my job for 9 years. The instinct to prepare for every version of a story before someone else got the chance to tell it first. When Judge Whitfield called the room back to order, I smoothed my jacket one more time and turned to face Ethan directly for the first time all morning. "Your Honor," I said, "I'd like to begin cross-examination." Behind me, I heard Richard shift in his seat, the leather creaking under the sudden tension in his body. He knew somehow before I even asked my first question that the version of this day he had imagined walking in was already gone. I walked toward the witness stand slowly, deliberately giving myself time to settle into the rhythm I remembered from 100 cross-examinations years ago. Ethan sat with his hands folded, trying for composure, but I knew that posture. I had seen it on witnesses before, the two still shoulders, the eyes fixed on some neutral point in the middle distance, the body's attempt to look calm when the mind is already scrambling. "Mr. Spencer," I said, "you testified earlier that your financial contributions to the household significantly exceeded mine. Is that correct?" "Yes." His voice was flat, careful. "And you'd agree that transparency around household finances is important in a marriage?" A small pause. "Of course." I opened my folder and retrieved the first document, sliding it toward the clerk to be marked as an exhibit. "I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit C, a transfer of $43,000 from your joint investment account to an account held solely in your sister's name, dated 6 weeks before you filed for divorce. Can you explain this transaction?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence, heavier, more personal. I watched something flicker across Ethan's face, not quite panic, but its first cousin. That was a loan. To help her with a down payment. A loan with no documentation, no promissory note, no repayment schedule, nothing in writing at all. "We didn't think we needed..." "Mr. Spencer, you're an accounts director. You structure financing agreements professionally. Are you asking this court to believe you moved $43,000 of marital assets without a single piece of paper to support it? Preston Cole rose halfway out of his chair. Objection, Your Honor, argumentative. Overruled, Judge Whitfield said, not even looking up from her notes. The witness may answer. Ethan's jaw tightened. I didn't think it mattered. I let that sit in the room for a moment before moving forward. I introduced the next exhibit: email correspondence between Ethan and a colleague named Melissa Cho, dated over a year prior, references to hotel stays in another city, references that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings reports. I didn't need to say the word affair out loud. The dates spoke for themselves, and I watched color drain slowly from Linda's face in the gallery as she realized what she was looking at. Mr. Spencer, isn't it true that Miss Cho is the same colleague referenced in these communications? This isn't relevant to custody, he said, his voice rising slightly. Your Honor, I'd ask the witness be instructed to answer the question. Answer the question, Mr. Spencer. Judge Whitfield said, her tone even but unmistakably firm. Yes, he said finally quietly. It's the same person. I moved through the rest of my questions methodically, each one built on the last, each answer narrowing the space he had to maneuver in. I asked about a second account, one that hadn't appeared anywhere in his financial disclosures. I watched Preston Cole's associate frantically flip through their own paperwork, searching for something that clearly wasn't there. I asked about a series of withdrawals timed suspiciously close to the day he'd filed for divorce, cash pulled from a joint account in increments small enough he'd apparently hoped to avoid notice. Then I turned to opposing counsel. Mr. Cole, during discovery, were you provided with full documentation of all accounts held by your client, joint or individual? Cole hesitated, glancing toward Ethan. To my understanding, yes. I retrieved one final document. Then perhaps you can explain why this account opened 4 months ago under an LLC registered to your client was never disclosed in any filing. I handed it to the clerk. I'd like this entered as Exhibit G. The color that left Preston Cole's face in that moment was something I recognized instantly, something I'd seen countless times in military courtrooms, when an attorney realizes in real time in front of a judge that their case has just developed a hole they cannot patch. He stood, started to object, then seemed to reconsider the wisdom of drawing more attention to the exhibit in question. Your Honor, he said instead, we'd request a brief recess to review this document. Granted, Judge Whitfield said. 15 minutes. As the room began to stir, chairs shifting, quiet conversations breaking out across the gallery, I allowed myself finally a slow breath. I didn't look back at Richard right away. When I did, I found him staring at me with an expression that had nothing left of the smugness from that morning, just something raw and unmoored, a man watching the ground shift beneath assumptions he'd held for over a decade. I heard him whisper to Linda, though not quietly enough. Impossible. I gathered my papers and squared them against the table, my hands steady, despite the pounding in my chest. 15 years of training had brought me to this exact moment, and I intended to use every remaining minute of it. Grace's face flashed in my mind again, and beneath the discipline holding me together, something fierce and protective settled deeper into place. This wasn't over. But for the first time since I'd walked into that courtroom that morning, I understood with complete certainty exactly how it was going to end. The recess stretched longer than the 15 minutes Judge Whitfield had granted. I sat alone at my table, watching through the courtroom's tall windows as clouds shifted over the parking lot, while somewhere down the hall, Preston Cole and his client were, I assumed, having a conversation neither of them wanted to have. Richard found me first. He crossed the gallery slowly, none of his earlier bravado left in his posture, and stopped a few feet from my table like a man approaching something he no longer fully understood. Up close, I could see the years on him differently than I ever had before, not distinguished the way I'd always framed him in my mind, but simply old, uncertain, caught off guard by a version of reality he hadn't accounted for. You were a JAG officer, he said. Not quite a question. I said. For 9 years. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching my face like he was trying to locate the woman he thought he'd known, inside the one standing in front of him now. "Why didn't you ever say anything in 12 years, Autumn? Not once." I thought about how to answer that honestly because some part of me understood this might be the only real conversation Richard Spencer and I ever had. "Because nobody ever asked," I said. "Not you, not Linda, not really Ethan after the first few months. I mentioned pieces of it early on, and I was told it made people uncomfortable. So I stopped mentioning it. It's easier to disappear than to keep explaining yourself to people who've already decided who you are." Richard's mouth opened, then closed. Something moved behind his eyes that looked almost like shame, though I wasn't ready yet to call it that. "I always thought," he started, then stopped himself, glancing down at his hands. "I don't know what I thought. You thought I was the girl who got lucky marrying into money." I said, not unkindly, just plainly, the way I might state a fact in an opening argument. "You thought the uniform was something I hid behind because I didn't have anything else. You've said versions of that to my face for over a decade, Richard. At Christmas, at Grace's christening, at your 40th anniversary party in front of 40 guests. He flinched at that last one, a memory clearly surfacing that he'd rather have left buried. "I didn't mean, I know you didn't think you meant it cruelly," I said. That's almost the harder part. Before he could respond, Grace's voice cut through the hallway, high and startled. I turned to find my daughter standing near the courtroom doors with my sister, who had brought her by during a school break period, unaware the timing would land her here in this hallway during this exact conversation. Grace's eyes moved between her grandfather and me, confusion, and something more searching in her expression. "Mom," she said quietly, "were you really a lawyer, like a real one?" My sister looked immediately apologetic, mouthing sorry over Grace's head, but I found I didn't mind. I knelt down slightly so I was closer to Grace's height the way I used to when she was smaller, and needed things explained gently. "I still am," I told her. "I just haven't needed to be one for a while." Grace considered that with the particular seriousness 10-year-olds reserve for things they're still deciding how to feel about. Then she wrapped her arms around my waist, quick and fierce, the way she used to hug me before school when she was much younger. I held onto her a beat longer than necessary, breathing in the strawberry shampoo smell of her hair, letting myself feel just for a moment something other than the careful control I'd been maintaining all morning. When the bailiff called us back into session, I kissed the top of Grace's head and sent her back with my sister, watching her small shape disappear around the corner before I turned back toward the courtroom doors. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Preston Cole looked like a man who had aged 5 years during the recess. Ethan sat beside him, staring straight ahead, refusing to look toward the gallery where his parents now sat, in visibly diminished silence. I took my seat and waited for Judge Whitfield to resume proceedings, feeling something settle inside me that I can only describe as clarity, not vindictive, not gloating, just clear the way the sky looks after a long storm has finally passed through. "Mrs. Spencer," Judge Whitfield said, "you may proceed with any remaining questions." I had a few left smaller details that closed remaining gaps in the financial record questions that took less than 10 minutes combined, but left no ambiguity about what had actually happened over the preceding year. When I finished, I told the court I had no further questions, and I returned to my seat with the quiet, contained satisfaction of someone who has done exactly what needed to be done, nothing more, nothing less. Preston Cole stood for closing remarks, and his earlier confidence had been replaced by something more careful, more measured, a man trying to salvage what he could from a case that had crumbled in ways he clearly hadn't anticipated when he woke up that morning. He spoke for less than 10 minutes, a fraction of his opening statement's length. When it was my turn, I stood, looked toward Judge Whitfield, and spoke plainly without embellishment, laying out simply what the evidence had shown: the concealment, the transfers, the timeline that told its own story without need of dramatic language. I sat down knowing I had said everything that needed saying. Judge Whitfield gathered her notes, looked out over the courtroom one final time, and announced she would return with her ruling that same afternoon. The courtroom filled again just after 2 in the afternoon, the air thick with a different kind of tension than the morning had carried, less certainty on one side, less bravado, a quiet that felt earned rather than performed. I sat at my table, hands folded, watching Judge Whitfield settle into her seat with the same unhurried composure she'd carried all day. "I've reviewed the evidence and testimony presented this morning," she began, "and I want to note for the record that this case presented itself very differently than either party's initial filings suggested." She looked briefly toward Preston Cole's table, then toward me before continuing. "On the matter of custody, the court finds that Major Spencer's military service, including her history as a judge advocate and her current role in the Army Reserve, does not constitute grounds for limiting her parental rights. In fact, the evidence presented regarding her demonstrated stability, professional discipline, and consistent presence in her daughter's life weighs significantly in her favor. Primary physical custody of the minor child is awarded to Major Spencer with a standard visitation schedule for Mr. Spencer subject to review." I felt something loosen in my chest, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months, finally released. Behind me I heard Linda make a small sound, not quite a sob, more like the air leaving a room all at once. "On the matter of marital assets," Judge Whitfield continued, "the court finds clear evidence of undisclosed accounts and improper transfers made by Mr. Spencer in the months preceding this filing in violation of standard disclosure requirements. Given this conduct, the court awards Major Spencer the marital home along with 65% of the couple's combined liquid assets and investment accounts. Mr. Spencer is ordered to return the full amount transferred to the account held in his sister's name with interest calculated from the date of transfer." Preston Cole's associate was writing quickly, her pen moving in short, urgent strokes. Ethan sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him, like a man watching a building he'd designed collapse in real time. Additionally, Judge Whitfield said, "Given the pattern of conduct demonstrated by Mr. Spencer's legal team's initial representations, and the significant burden placed on Major Spencer in having to independently identify and document these discrepancies, the court finds it appropriate that Mr. Spencer bear a substantial portion of the legal costs associated with this proceeding." She set down her papers. "This court is adjourned." The room dissolved into motion, the low murmur of gathering papers, chairs scraping back the particular rustle of people trying to process something they hadn't expected to witness. I stayed seated a moment longer than necessary, letting the weight of it settle over me slowly, the way relief sometimes arrives not as a rush, but as a tide, gradual and complete. Richard approached again as the courtroom emptied, moving slower. This time, none of the confidence from that morning left in him at all. He stood in front of my table for a long moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one. Not the kind I've offered before when I said sorry just to end an argument." I studied him for a moment, trying to decide how much of this was genuine and how much was simply the disorientation of a man who'd spent a decade certain of something that had just proven completely wrong. Perhaps it didn't matter which it was. Perhaps what mattered was that he was saying it at all, standing there in a nearly empty courtroom instead of walking away with his pride intact. "You didn't disrespect me because you knew who I was," I said finally. "You disrespected me because you thought you already did." He absorbed that, quietly nodding, once something in his face settling into an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not quite humility, but its early beginnings, the kind that might with time grow into something real. "Grace," he said, "would it be all right if I still—" "She's your granddaughter, Richard. That doesn't change. But how you speak about her mother in front of her, that's going to change starting today." "Understood," he said, and for the first time in 12 years, I believed he actually meant it. I gathered my folder, my papers, the careful architecture of evidence I'd built over months of quiet preparation, and I walked out of that courthouse into afternoon light that felt different somehow than it had that morning, sharper, cleaner, like something had been washed clear. My sister was waiting outside with Grace, who ran toward me the moment she saw me come down the steps, uniform jacket still on folder tucked under my arm. I knelt down and caught her, holding on for a long moment, feeling the solid, real weight of her against me, the one thing in this entire year that had never once been in question. "Did you win?" she asked into my shoulder. I pulled back enough to look at her face at the particular curiosity she'd inherited from somewhere deep in my own family line, and I found myself smiling in a way that felt entirely unguarded for the first time in longer than I could remember. "I told the truth," I said. "That's usually enough." The weeks that followed the ruling passed in a strange, quiet rhythm, the kind that comes after a long fight finally ends, not dramatic, not cinematic, just the slow return of ordinary life. I moved back into the house alone with Grace packed away Ethan's remaining belongings into boxes he picked up on a Saturday morning quiet, and diminished a man who had lost far more than a legal battle. Ethan didn't fight the ruling. His attorneys advised against an appeal once the full financial picture came into focus, once it became clear that pursuing this further would only expose more of what he'd tried to hide. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd left his position at the firm not long after, whether by choice or quiet pressure I never confirmed and never asked about. I found somewhat to my own surprise that I didn't need to know. The anger I'd carried through those final months of marriage had burned itself out somewhere in that courtroom, replaced by something calmer, more settled. Richard called every few weeks after that, tentative at first, careful, in a way he'd never been before. He started asking questions instead of making assumptions about my work, about the reserve, about a case I'd handled years earlier, that he'd apparently thought about more than once since that day in court. It wasn't a complete transformation. Old habits don't dissolve overnight, and there were still moments where I caught traces of the old dismissiveness in his voice before he corrected himself. But he was trying in a way he'd never once tried during the 12 years I'd been part of his family, and I found I could meet that effort with something other than resentment. Linda took longer. She sent a card a month after the hearing brief, and formal an apology folded into careful, measured language. I didn't need grand gestures from her. I understood better than most that some people show up slowly in small increments, and that the increments matter more than the speed. Grace adjusted the way children often do, with a resilience that both humbled and worried me. She started asking more questions about my time in the Army, about the cases I'd worked, about what it actually meant to be a judge advocate. One evening, doing homework at the kitchen table, she looked up and asked if she could be a lawyer someday too. I told her she could be anything she wanted, but that if she chose law, I'd teach her everything I knew about standing your ground in a room full of people who've already decided not to listen. I think about that morning, often walking into that courtroom alone, watching Richard laugh, feeling the weight of every assumption in that room settle against me like a held breath. I think about how easy it would have been to prove myself sooner, to correct them the first time someone made a joke about my uniform, to insist on being seen the way I wanted to be seen. For years I told myself silence was strength, that not needing their validation was its own kind of victory. I understand now that both things can be true at once. I didn't need their approval, and I still deserved better than their assumptions. Learning to hold both of those truths without letting either one collapse into the other, that more than the ruling itself felt like the real victory of that year. There's a version of this story where I spend the ending focused on what Ethan lost on Richard's humbled apology, on the satisfaction of watching people who underestimated me finally understand who they'd been dismissing all along. That satisfaction is real, and I won't pretend otherwise. But if I'm honest, the ending that matters most to me isn't about them at all. It's about Grace sitting across from me some evenings now, asking real questions and getting real answers. It's about the quiet, unremarkable freedom of not having to shrink myself at my own dinner table anymore. It's about waking up in a house that finally feels entirely mine, built on nothing but the truth of who I actually am, no longer folded away to keep someone else comfortable. People like to say the law protects those who understand it best. I think that's only half true. The law protects those who are prepared to stand in front of it and tell the truth clearly without flinching, no matter how long they've had to wait for the chance to say it. I waited 15 years for a room to finally hear that version of me. When it finally did, I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in being seen completely for the first time in over a decade. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know what you think this story leaves you with. Have you ever had to prove yourself to people who'd already decided who you were, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below, where you're watching from, what stayed with you most. We share stories like this every day, real ones about family resilience and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. So if this one moved, you consider subscribing so you don't miss the next. Thank you for walking through this one with me. Let's keep going together.